Amendment Day, where we're going to talk about the clash of rights and student protests on university campuses. I am Dr. Amanda Reed. I'm faculty co-director for the Center for Media Law and Policy, and this is First Amendment Day. I'm going to introduce the moderator, who will then in turn introduce the speaker. There will be an opportunity for Q&A, so I hope you brought your cues. You're going to get answers. So if you don't have questions, start writing them down. I'm going to call on you. So there's got to be there's no free lunch. Did you know that there's something in exchange for the dinner? Oh, you got to ask questions. So this is how this is going to go down. So I am going to introduce the moderator. It is Dr. Evan Ringel. He is an assistant professor at App State teaching media law. Evan Ringel is a lifelong learner. His undergraduate degree is in music performance, specifically jazz trombone. And while he is a talented musician, that does, of course, not define him. He is also a top media law scholar. In his time at Carolina, he earned not only a law degree, but also a master's as well as a PhD from this fine journalism school. His scholarly works sit at the intersection of First Amendment, state-level government regulation, like on facial recognition technology, and big tech self-governance, as well as civil rights. His dissertation was on academic freedom and is so well-versed on on-campus happenings. To answer his varied research questions, he has both a qualitative and quantitative methods background. He has an interdisciplinary approach to media law research, which has earned him top awards and notable invitations, including to be the moderator for tonight's keynote. As someone keenly aware of Evan Ringel's background and expertise, I unreservedly say that we are very fortunate to have him as our moderator. Dr. Ringel, please come on up.
Dr. Reed. Thank you so much to Dr. Reed for the overly kind introduction. And thanks to the Center for Media Law and Policy for bringing me back today for today's event. It's an honor to be back at the Huston School for what should be a really lively session about campus speech, student protests, and the First Amendment. And it is even more of an honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Lindsay currently serves as the Director of Campus Rights Advocacy at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights Expression. She's been at FIRE since 2019. She previously worked as a student press counsel, focusing on student journalism issues. Today is also a homecoming of sorts for Lindsay. Like myself, she's a graduate of the dual degree MA/JD program at UNC Chapel Hill, where she researched and published on administrative censorship of student media and the application of the government speech doctrine to university students. She's admitted to practice law in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. She's a true First Amendment expert. And we were so lucky to have her here to talk about student protests, free speech.
It's really weird to have one say that I'm a First Amendment expert and then be called up to do a keynote speech here because it was only 6 years ago that I was sitting there writing down my questions to ask. But anyway, I'm Lindsay, as Adam just said. Today we're going to talk about clashes on campus, specifically what's going on with student protests, not just in this moment right now, but also historically, what does the First Amendment have to say about student protests? And then we're going to get into some, I don't know, big questions, I guess, that I've been mulling over late at night when I have insomnia, I can't get to sleep. I do want to just preface by saying that although I am the Director of Rights Advocacy at FIRE, not everything that I say during this keynote is necessarily a FIRE stance. Some of what you're going to get tonight is hot takes with Lindsay, not just FIRE. So just be aware that it may not all be precisely from the party line. I want to start with a few operating assumptions that I'm going to have in the back of my mind as we talk through these. The first is, oh, this one is weird. Okay, it's fine. The first is that the word activism. We get a lot of, I think there's a lot of connotations that go along with the word activism, and people have started to feel like maybe it's that's not a nice way of talking about health. Although I think it's the word activism is starting to be reclaimed a little bit. I want to say that I am operating under the assumption that activism is not a dirty word. So when I use the word activist throughout this presentation, that is not a dig at folks who are engaged in this type of activity. So I want to start with that. The second is that free speech is hard work. It's really worthwhile, but it's hard. First Amendment advocates, I think in general, forget to mention this a lot of the time. They're like, oh yeah, all you gotta do is listen. It's not that hard. You just have to listen to other people. But listening can be really, really tough sometimes, right? Like hearing opinions that are so vastly different from your own, and that may feel even like not just offensive, but like viscerally wrong to you. It's not easy. It's hard work. But like a lot of other things in life that are hard, free speech is worthwhile, and we're gonna circle back to this. Okay, so now that we have those operating assumptions, this is what we're gonna talk about. So first we're gonna talk a little bit about the history of protests on campus, and then we're gonna talk about the law, and then we're going to talk about, kind of after we talk about the law, we're gonna talk about some recent First Amendment violations that we've been seeing on campuses. And then some of those big questions that Lindsay's insomnia questions will come next. And then we're gonna have a lot of time for Q&A because I'm hoping that you all have lots of questions given the climate that you have been living through. Okay, so starting with the history of campus protests. I actually am not a historian and didn't know that much about the history of campus protests until I started researching for this slide. So I knew some of these, but I was really interested to learn that the first campus protest that we can find like good records of was at Fisk University in 1924. It was against racist policies. Specifically, Fisk is a HBCU, and they had policies that students had to dress in genteel clothing and participate in Jim Crow concerts where they would sing for their white friends, I guess. And students understandably didn't love those policies and took to protest and civil disobedience in order to get the president of Fisk to get out of office and get new policies enacted, and they were successful. In the late 1930s to 40s, we have a lot of anti-war protests that happen on campuses that are against the United States joining the Second World War. What's interesting about these protests is they were called strikes for peace, but I think we look back on them and a lot of them were, a lot of like the signs that were held during these protests, for example, this picture has some of them in the top right here, were sort of like Nazi apologism that was going on, that was under the guise of isolationism. So one through line that you might notice here as I go through the rest of the list is like politically, these protests are happening on like all sides of the political spectrum. In the 60s, we had both pro and anti-segregation protests, but the one that I highlighted here is at Ole Miss when Ole Miss was finally desegregated. There were huge protests related to that. In the mid-1960s, you had the free speech movement at Berkeley and anti-McCarthyism protests on campus. In 1970, I'm sure you've all heard about the Penn State massacre that happened. Also at University of Michigan that same year, a big climate protest where they talked about population control and eugenics as a means of supporting environmentalism. And then in 1985, in protests that in a lot of ways mirrored what we saw last semester at Columbia University, there were anti-apartheid protests where they similarly, took over some campus buildings. So I guess, when we have these, I've heard a lot of this rhetoric with the moment that we're living in right now, with the Israeli-Palestinian protests that are happening on campus, that like, oh, this is a new moment in American history, like this campus protest has never been this bad. And I bring this slide to your attention to say like, that's not really historically accurate. I mean, here we have situations going all the way back 100 years to 1924, where students, engaged in both protected forms of protest, like, like taking their signs out on the quad, and unprotected forms of civil disobedience, like taking over campus buildings. This is not new. This has been happening for 100 years. And the fact that they include a mix of protected and unprotected expression is also not new. That's been happening for 100 years. Okay, so I want to move to talking a little bit about what the law has to say about campus protest. And I want to preface this by saying that the law can't answer all of our problems. The law isn't designed to solve society's ills, all society's ills. And so what I'm going to be telling you is like what is legally protected versus what is not legally protected. But that's not the same as telling you like what is morally right versus morally wrong, or ethically right versus ethically wrong. Those are different things. And we can get into that in Q&A if any of you have questions about that, but I would posit that the fact that they're different is actually a good thing. So the First Amendment, a lot of times I get reporters who ask me, well, can you explain to me like what kinds of protests are protected by the First Amendment? And the way that I answer that question is always, can I tell you what's not protected by the First Amendment? Because generally speaking, the First Amendment protects expression unless it doesn't, right? It's easier to talk about what isn't included in the protection of the First Amendment than what is. And I think about unprotected speech as coming in two categories. The first is speech that is not protected because it's part of one of these historical categories of speech that the Supreme Court and other courts said this is not included in the First Amendment. So things like truth threats, things like incitement, imminent incitement to violence, defamation, obscenity, child pornography, those types of things, right? When it comes to protests on campus, we have been seeing, vandalism is an example. This is a sculpture, that's the word I'm looking for, that is about gay rights, and there were some non-binary folks who felt like it was not. This sculpture was of two men, and they felt that it was not representative of the gay rights movement, and so they painted it and put wigs on it. And this, I think we can all agree that this is expressive, right? But it's also an act of vandalism in that it defaced this piece of art, and therefore is not necessarily protected. But true threats, I think we hear all the time lately that certain chants that people might say, like from the river to the sea, right? That maybe those are threatening or those are inciting. And I think one thing that we really have to remember about both true threats and incitement is there has to be an imminent aspect to it. So not every offensive statement, so not every subjectively offensive statement is necessarily going to be a threat or an incitement. The second sort of umbrella of unprotected speech that I think came up in the news a lot in the spring was time, place, and manner restrictions. And it was really an interesting moment to see those come up in the news because, I've been thinking about time, place, and manner restrictions for like a decade, but most people, I think, probably had never heard of what a time, place, and manner restriction was before the protests sort of erupted last winter and spring. But time, place, and manner restrictions are ways to regulate speech that isn't unprotected, generally speaking, but might be unprotected because of the time, the place, or the way in which the protest is occurring. And people deal with these types of regulations all the time. So most people live in a town that has a noise ordinance, right? That says you can't mow your lawn or use a megaphone between the hours of 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. That's a time, place, and manner restriction, right? That says you can't use loud noises, amplified sound in a certain hours because people are sleeping, right? There's a legitimate purpose for it. And with these time, place, and manner restrictions, again, they can only regulate the time, place, or the way of the protest. They can't be based on the content of the speech. So you couldn't have a town ordinance, for example, that says no political use of megaphones after 9 p.m. It has to just be no use of megaphones, right? It can't have any relation to the content of the expression itself. And it also has to leave open alternative ways for you to communicate. So, you know, you can get on the radio, or you can do your protest during the daytime hours with your amplified sound, or you can have a silent protest after hours. But there have to be other ways for you to get your message across. And it has to have some logical purpose to government interest. So things like, you know, a noise ordinance allowing people in residential areas to sleep. Now, the reason that this is super pertinent right now, and frankly more pertinent than the unprotected categories of speech on the last slide that I just flew through, and there's a good reason I just flew through them, because this is what we've been debating about since October of last year, right? Can you have tents on campus? Can universities ban tents on campus? Can universities ban all indoor protests? Can universities ban you having signs on the quad? Those are all questions of, is this a time, place, and manner restriction? And if so, is it a legitimate time, place, and manner restriction? One really common one on campus that this photo relates to is that a lot of the time, if you want to use a table for your expressive event, maybe to like gather signatures or, you know, get people to join your club or just spread awareness about a particular issue, you have to reserve space in that outdoor area in order to have your table on campus. And that's generally considered an okay time, place, and manner restriction because most of the time campuses don't have unlimited space for unlimited number of people, right? It's not about the content. It doesn't matter if you're Young Americans for Freedom, like this picture, or if you are Students for Justice in Palestine, or if you are any group. The same rule applies to everyone, that you cannot have a table unless you reserve the space ahead of time. And there's other ways to engage in expression, right? You could still go gather signatures just with your clipboard without a table, right? There's other ways to approach it. And this is a picture of some of our friends at Young Americans for Freedom violating the rule. They then got told they had to leave, and because again, it's a rule violation. And then they made a little TikTok video, posted on TikTok about how they were being censored. And I want to posit that this is like some of the other things that we're going to talk about later, an instance of civil disobedience, right? They're here, they're sitting on campus with a table, breaking the rules. They're going to make their TikTok video talking about how their treatment has been unfair. And it's interesting because this is a form of civil disobedience that's happening on the conservative side on campus, but it's really common. So the civil disobedience is an interesting aspect of protest rights, free expression, because it's not protected by the First Amendment, right? The word disobedience is there for a reason, right? Because you're disobeying, you're doing something that isn't allowed. It's an intentional violation of rules in order to make some sort of point. So, in this picture, this is those anti-apartheid protests that happened on Columbia campus in the 80s and 90s. But it includes things like sit-ins, like blockades on roads, like leaking documents, you know, Snowden, like I think we could call that an act of civil disobedience, for example, occupations of buildings. And I think we often connect civil disobedience to the civil rights movement, and a lot of people connect it, I think, reasonably, it makes sense, to Martin Luther King Jr., who said that when one breaks the law that conscience tells him it's unjust, he must do it openly, he must do it cheerfully, he must do it lovingly, he must do it civilly, not uncivilly, and he must do it with a willingness to accept the penalty. And I think that this is just a great sum up of what civil disobedience looks like, right? It's not protected, legally speaking. It's breaking the law, and you may face repercussions for it. And that's in some ways part of the power of what civil disobedience brings to the table, is the fact that you are willing to accept the penalty for breaking the rules. given your perspective on the issue. And all of that is not to say, so I think we've talked a lot about, in general, what the First Amendment does on campus. But I want to talk a little bit more about what's going on in this moment. And I know we're going to get to most of this during the Q&A. I'm frankly just trying to sort of frame the conversation so that we can have a really fun Q&A session. But universities have not been acting in good faith during these recent protests related to Israel and Palestine. In Texas, the governor actually introduced an executive order banning any speech against Israel on campuses, telling universities that they must punish students who engage in anti-Israel speech, which obviously shuts down pretty much any pro-Palestinian protest that might happen there. Or maybe doesn't shut it down, but it certainly threatens that speech. At Indiana University, and that's what this picture is of, they have a campus green that has traditionally been open to all kinds of protests, like even camping, which a lot of schools have had no camping policies for decades. Indiana University explicitly allowed camping on this campus green and has had over the years many camping protests where people had brought in tents to protest the treatment of unhoused individuals, or that who camped there for any number of reasons. And the night before a planned Palestinian solidarity protest, they changed the policy for this campus green, literally in the middle of the night, to say you're not allowed to have tents or any signs that are not held by a person, or all kinds of other protests that they banned, literally in the middle of the night before this planned encampment protest that was supposed to start the next day. And to top it off, they brought in some snipers to help make the students who came to participate in the protest feel extra comfortable, right? That's always their goal. Then Columbia denied recognition to students against anti-Semitism in the wake of everything that was going on. Johns Hopkins suspended a professor for posting anti-Palestinian tweets, and at NYU, if you look at my organization's website right now, probably, I think, or maybe tomorrow, you'll see a whole list of all the ways that they have discriminated against pro-Palestinian speakers and really just participated in a pattern of anti-Palestinian censorship over the last 6 months to maybe a year. So universities aren't acting in good faith. Like, I'm not here to argue that because they can put together time, place, and manner restrictions, or because they can, restrict your ability to participate in incitement or true threats, that suddenly that gives them the right to do things like put snipers on the top of buildings in order to encourage you to protest or discourage you to protest, as it were. But when I'm thinking about all these things, right? So we talked about history. We've talked about the law a little bit. We've talked about what's going on campus right now a little bit. It brings up a bunch of questions to my mind. Now I'm going to get to the questions that keep me up at night. So first, my hypothesis is that free expression, especially civic free expression, so that is where people are actually having a cross dialogue, not just engaging in protest, but actually engaging in conversation, is really hard work. Protest is also hard work. But in general, free speech is really hard work. It's worthwhile, but it's hard. But like other things that are hard but worthwhile, so like I have a 2-year-old, and this last weekend, my husband was out of town, and oh my gosh, solo parenting a 2-year-old is so hard. It's so hard to keep him entertained, so hard to deal with all the tantrums. But you know what? That kid is like the best thing that's ever happened to me, so worthwhile. And so hard. Also, my husband I'm getting my retribution right now. So I'm here and he's at home with the 2-year-old. So, it all evens out in the end. But like anything that's hard, like math. Math is really freaking hard, at least for me. I don't know if any of you are math wizards, but like, I cannot do addition. Don't ask me to do addition. I can't. I just can't do it. Give me my calculator and then I'll be fine. But I cannot do addition. But math is important, right? Like, it's good to like be able to do your own taxes, which requires some math and having to pull out your calculator every time you need to do like 2 plus, I don't know, some crazy number. I could do 2 plus 2, so I can't give that example. But anytime, but like having to pull out your calculator every time you need to do simple math is kind of annoying as someone who has to do that. So it's a worthwhile thing to learn, right? But at least for me, it's really freaking hard. I'm sure there's a bunch of people who are journalism types in the room. Who's from Husband? Yeah, okay, so a bunch of you are journalism types. Writing is freaking hard. Journalism is hard, right? And then it's worthwhile because it supports our democracy. So I think just like all of those things that are hard and worthwhile, free speech has to be modeled and it has to be taught. And I don't think we've been doing that. As a society, I think, and especially educational institutions, especially colleges and universities, but also K-12 educational institutions, I think we've really failed to model and teach free speech. And so we're ending up in this situation where folks are turning to civil disobedience, turning to these incendiary isn't quite the right word, but these more bombastic forms of protest, right? As a way to raise their voices because we're not having these conversations across differences. We're not having discourse across differences. So that's the only way within our current society where you're gonna have your voice be heard is by engaging in these more bombastic forms of protest. And to be clear, I'm not saying that they are not valuable, that bombastic forms of protest, or that even civil disobedience isn't valuable. I think that it is valuable. But I just wonder if we're missing another piece of the puzzle, which is this, sort of civil discourse. So I often think to myself, when educational institutions have proven time and time again, and especially in this current moment with the protests around Israel and Palestine, but also, previously, I've been part of cases where a student was in trouble for encouraging people to become vegan because people were offended by pictures of, slaughtered animals that she showed them. And so she was literally like facing suspension for showing her friends some pictures of slaughtered cows. Like, it's not just Israel Palestine, right? I mean, think about the Black Lives Matter movement that was just a couple of years ago. Students were being censored in droves during that movement. So time and time again, not just in this moment, but in many moments, and even going all the way back to 1924, students or institutions have shown that they cannot tolerate controversial conversation. They have a really hard time dealing with controversial conversations. And if universities, which within our sort of framework of the marketplace of ideas, which is a First Amendment framework that basically says that we have to be able to exchange ideas in order to ultimately figure out what's the truth. We generally think of academic institutions as the center of that, right? This is where you're supposed to be having conversations across differences in order to try to figure out, like, what's the real situation here? What's the truth here? And if we're not doing that at educational institutions, and if educational institutions are in fact oppositional to that, then the question is, how do we expect young people, but not just young people, because I actually think some of you are better at this than us older folks, but society at large to have conversations across differences. How can we expect civic discourse to happen at a larger scale if K-12, institutions, and especially upper education, isn't doing this? And I think we can see that reflected not just on campus protests that you all are familiar with, but also in our larger society, with politics in our country right now. So I'm on, I guess, a mission to get universities to reinvest in the importance of modeling and teaching civic discourse. I really think that more universities need to have, as part of the curriculum, like how do we engage in discourse across differences? But not just in the curriculum, I think we need to make space for these conversations. And this type of thing is a really good start, but this isn't it, right? When we have students out on the quad who are protesting in support of Palestine, and then we have counter protesters who come out to join them, and instead of encouraging that exchange, the university calls in the police, like that is not making space for discourse across differences. So my biggest call out is to universities that they need to act to teach what civic discourse is supposed to look like. So then I also have a question or a challenge for student activists, which is not to stop your activism. I want to make that really super clear. Like, I am not here to tell you to stop being activists because that would be contrary to every bone in my body. But I am here to ask you if you've thought about your goals and if you've thought about the ways in which you are engaging in activism, if those are furthering your goals. And actually, it was very interesting at the 2 p.m. panel, there was a student leader from Students for Justice in Palestine here on campus who was talking about how they grapple with this. Like, are our tactics working? Are they making people want to support Palestine more, or are they not? And this is something, I guess, that they engage in conversation about constantly. And I was really glad to hear that because I think that's a really important question for student activists to be asking themselves. Who is your audience? Like, what do you want them to do? Do you want them to change their mind? And how do you engage in activism that really changes those hearts and minds? And I'm, again, not saying you're doing it wrong, to be really clear. I'm saying you just have to constantly be thinking about this because this is a moving target. So free speech has, and does change the world. And it is our obligation as members of this society, as members of this democracy, to figure out how to make free speech work for us to make the changes in the world that we want to see. And the First Amendment obviously plays a part in that, but it's not all of that. And history plays a part in that, but it's not all of that. And that's where I'm gonna leave it. And I intentionally didn't talk much about protests on campus because I know you all have experienced them firsthand. And I'm very excited to hear your questions about what has been happening in this moment. So I'm gonna turn it back over to Evan.
Yeah. Now a second. Okay. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for a fascinating discussion on, I think, something that's been very salient for a while.
I think the fascinating discussion is about to start.
Well, it's already teed up perfectly. I'm going to open it up shortly for some questions, but I wanted to start with kind of a couple of questions to kind of tease out some of what you're talking about and maybe tee up this discussion that will probably be fairly focused on campus protests. So I love that your presentation starts with the history of campus protest. I think that's a really helpful kind of framework to think about where we are now in this moment. I'm hopeful this will kind of be a framing question of sorts for the rest of the discussion today. So maybe this is big, but what do you think is the value of campus protests? As someone who defends it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, I really strongly believe in the ability of especially young people, college students, and even younger, to like shape our future. And so much of, I mean, if we go back to that slide, which I don't know what I did with Flickr, so I won't, but I mean, so many of those examples are things, or they were protesting for things that we now just think of as like, yeah, that, like, of course we're against segregation. Of course, we're, you know, against McCarthyism, like, you know, things like that, that really shaped, like, but at that time, we weren't, of course, we're against segregation, right? Like, that wasn't the moment we were in. So I think protest has definitely the ability to like shape the future, for better or for worse.
I love that. So you talked about civil disobedience, right? And this is something that I think we grapple with in terms of methods.
Yeah.
There's always the discussion of, well, it's not what you say, it's how you say it or how you act it out or whatever. And as you talked about, the law provides protection to a certain extent for what you say and how you say it. You know,
Right.
there are obvious limitations based on unprotected categories of speech or time, place, and manner restrictions, that sort of thing. I'm wondering if you can talk about the balancing of sort of free speech and First Amendment rights for protesters who end up resorting to civil disobedience. So if I'm a protester, my message hasn't been heard, I am ending up engaging in civil disobedience, which has happened here and elsewhere,
Yeah.
right? Am I ceding my First Amendment protections? What does that look like in terms of residual speech kind of, you know, am I just screwed? You know, am I just accepting the consequences and moving on? Or
I mean, I hope you're not just screwed, but so your First Amendment protections for the protected speech that you may have engaged in before you started engaging in civil disobedience stay intact. You still can't get in trouble, you can't get arrested, you can't get, you know, suspended for any of the stuff that you did before engaging in civil disobedience. When it comes to civil disobedience itself, the next question we have to ask after, like, did you break a rule? Which, if it's civil disobedience, the answer is yes. The next question that we have to ask is the institution, so the police or the university, that is trying to impose discipline upon you, have they imposed similar discipline upon folks who maybe have a different perspective than you do in the past? Or is this they're really picking on you? So for example, earlier I heard that apparently there had been people who had camped on campus here at UNC previous to October 7 for unrelated reasons. I don't remember even what, I think.
I can't remember
Yeah.
what the details
And they never got in trouble for that. But then when tents came to campus related to, you know, supporting Palestine, that suddenly now you're not allowed to have tents on campus. That policy has been in place for a long time, but apparently wasn't being policed until it was a pro-Palestinian protest using tents on campus. I have to say, like, I have not looked into the veracity of that allegation, so I don't know. Like, I am not alleging right now in this moment that UNC engaged in viewpoint discrimination. But if that were true, if that is true, that they had this policy in place but haven't acted upon it until it was particular people with a particular point of view, and now suddenly they're sending police to arrest folks and suspend folks, that's viewpoint discrimination. So you still can have like an unequal application of the rules based on viewpoint either.
Now, we also heard earlier today in that same presentation, I believe, some discussion of when the university, not only the presence of punishing a violation of a rule versus not punishing a violation of a rule, in this case encampments, but also differential in terms of how students were treated when they were being punished for similar things. So like we heard about a student who allegedly hadn't received a path to reinstatement at the university, even though other students who committed similar acts had. Is that also a form of viewpoint discrimination, or is it just very?
I mean, it would depend on why they're treating them differently. If they're treating them differently because he was like more outspoken than other people, or because he's more pro-Palestine than other people, or something like that, it could be viewpoint discrimination. But if they're doing it because his civil disobedience broke the rules more than other people's civil disobedience did, or he engaged in civil disobedience more often, or something like it really is contextual.
Okay.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Sorry, that's not a satisfactory answer.
No, that is, I'm very satisfactory answer.
Okay.
So the First Amendment, right, is very much at the heart of this. And the First Amendment applies to state action, right, to government
Right.
action, so it applies on public university campuses. I'm wondering if, in the context of your work, thinking about campus rights advocacy, how you approach things differently for, like, you gave examples of both public and private
I
universities,
did, yeah,
right?
yeah.
How do you approach that differently? How does your organization approach that differently? Are there still like legal justifications that should be used regardless?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We based our application of sort of First Amendment adjacent doctrine or First Amendment theory on private campuses on their policies. So places like Columbia, it's a private institution, but they have very clear policies on their website, in their student handbook, in their faculty handbook, frankly, all over their website. It's like, we love free speech here. You get all the rights to free speech you want. And so we hold them to that, right? Like it's essentially like a contract agreement. But like if you are going to put in your student handbook, on your marketing materials, you know, and build this expectation in students and faculty that they have free speech on your campus, and you recruit students and faculty with that promise, right? That you're gonna come here and you're gonna have free speech, and then you fail to follow through on that promise, like that's a truth in advertising problem. And so we approach it in that way. And then there's also some states like California, for example, that has the Leonard Law, which is essentially a state law that applies the First Amendment or First Amendment-like protections on even private institutions. So in some states, it's a little bit of an easier argument because of state law, but certainly like the truth in advertising, I think that's key.
Okay, yeah. So one of the criticisms here, zooming back in to UNC, I was here in the spring, I graduated this summer, I'm now not here. One of the criticisms to the university's response to the protests here at UNC, the encampment, the scene of the flagpole, et cetera, and you kind of alluded to this, was the deployment of police, right? And the suggestion, and you know, this is oft contested, in terms of when police were deployed, how they were deployed, the amount of notice people were given in terms of police being deployed. I'm wondering if there's like a threshold that you think is when police should, and you talked about this in context of like deploying police inherently limits civic discourse, right? So
Yeah.
when should police be deployed if, I mean, there's a line somewhere, right? How do we determine that line?
That's a really hard question.
Sorry.
And it's made harder by the fact that like I'm a First Amendment lawyer, not a, you know,
Right.
I'm not an expert in law enforcement. I'm
Okay.
not, you know, even a due process expert or
Right.
anything like that. And so I don't know what that line is, but I do know when I can identify that when you change a policy in the middle of the night, for example, at Indiana, and that's where you go from allowing certain types of protests to suddenly disallowing with no notice those same types of protests. And you call in snipers to, you know, to further censor, to further silence students, that is crossing the line. University of Texas at Austin was another really good example. Like there was a peaceful protest happening there where people were like fully peaceful. There was not even a single allegation of violence at UT Austin. And they called in the police and had them round up all the students and arrest them. Like I think that is disproportionate. I don't know exactly where the line is, I guess, but I know when it's been flagrantly crossed.
Right. It inflames, for sure, right?
Right.
I mean, I think there's no debate about the fact that deploying police to a protest inherently inflames the situation, often significantly.
Right. I think, there's no question that it's an escalation, you know, whether sometimes it's a necessary escalation, I don't know, that's not something that I have the expertise to answer.
So I don't think it's news, right? And you talked about this extensively, like campus protests right now is very centered around this burgeoning war between Israel and Palestine, and increasingly surrounding countries like Lebanon. It continues to be kind of the forefront of campus protests. And accordingly, culturally, a lot of the uproar we've seen has been around these liberal, pro-Palestinian protests, at least that's how it's been characterized in terms of encampments, marches, and stuff like that. We've seen a lot of political rhetoric, right? But you talked about the fact that campus protest regularly is coming from all sides of the political spectrum. I'm wondering if you could talk about, so two-part question.
Yeah.
How do we sort through the political nature of this? Do we just like try and stick to these free speech and principles response just generally? And then as a follow-up, do you see differences in how different, different approaches for political protest, is the right protesting differently than the left is, for example? Do you see differences
Yeah.
in your work?
I'm gonna answer the second question first, it's more interesting.
Cool. Perfect.
Absolutely different sides of the political spectrum protest differently and engage in civil disobedience differently. I noticed in my work that folks on the left are more likely to do things like take to the quad with signs or tents, to engage in that kind of very loud form of protest. Folks on the right are more likely to do what I was talking about with the tables, right? Where they go out, they bring their table, and they protest without having made a reservation, knowing full well that they were supposed to have made a reservation, and then post it on TikTok that they're being censored. And if you strip the content out of what they're saying, right? It's really not, it's not that different. Bringing a tent to the quad without a reservation and bringing a table to the quad without a reservation, they're violating the same rule, but I guess the vibes are different, right? I mean, there's a difference between a loud protest and a table of a few people. Folks on the left, I think, are more likely to shut down speakers, for example, as a form of civil disobedience. Folks on the right are real keen on, their professor watch lists and that kind of thing as a way of, if you want to get into cancel culture, that's the right's way of canceling people is by posting a list of people who are too liberal for their liking. So it's the same and different simultaneously, right? They might be kind of engaging in the same basic form of protest or basic form of civil disobedience, but it just feels different.
And so there's definitely, Dr. Reed in many words talked about my research on academic freedom, which was very kind of her. But one of the things that I really dove into was these university presidents, right? And this anti-Semitism hearing by the House Committee on Education and the Workforce. And a lot of that at the university level, especially at the university administration level, it kind of, they were asked essentially how they should respond and how their universities should respond to chants that advocate for the genocide of the Jewish people, referring to from the river to the sea, as you mentioned. And their responses were essentially, personally, I think these are wrong. As a law, as a university level, it depends. A lawyer's favorite answer, it depends. And these responses were panned, right? They were characterized as lawyerly. These presidents were forced out. Obviously it was more complicated than that, but that was sort of the movement. How do we view that? How do we take what is essentially just a statement of what the First Amendment tells us when that is, seen as an inappropriate response?
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy the position that those administrators were in. I don't think they've handled it particularly well, but I'm not sure I would have handled it any better.
Right.
Being called before Congress to answer those types of very politically difficult questions, where someone's going to be mad at you no matter what you say. That's not a fun position for them to be in. And this isn't really getting into my First Amendment expertise as much as it, as a human being, I do think that using a little bit of empathy can go a long way. You can talk about the fact that this is what the First Amendment says, but you can recognize that, like I said earlier, the First Amendment and law in general isn't here to answer all of society's ills. Just because something is protected speech doesn't mean it's good speech or nice speech. It's just, it means it's legally protected. And I feel like there was a little bit of humanity missing from the responses. Also, I'm not sure they got the legal side of things correct either, 'cause I'm not sure. But it depends that, I mean, are there certain situations where maybe saying from the river to the sea could be part of like a pattern of harassment? Maybe, but it would be really tough to get there. Like, generally speaking, chanting from the river to the sea is protected expression.
Pretty much. Okay, so I'd like to open it up now, and I'm hopeful that, I mean, questions can be as focused on UNC or as broad as we want, but I think this has kind of laid the framework for what is a really, obviously a very hot button issue and one that's very complicated, whether we look at it from a legal perspective or a humanistic perspective or any combination of that. So I am going to walk around and solicit questions. I see we've got one over here already. Now pass the microphone.
I don't need
Audio doesn't pick it up.
There are a couple of answers you said. I don't think the university responded correctly. I guess my question, and any of you guys can answer this, right? It's specific to Carolina, protesting, sort of giving students the avenue to share things that matter. Most of them are in line with our best traditions here, and that is acceptable. But there are certain avenues that the university needs students and students organizations to go through to sort of keep order on campus. And so my question to you is sort of what university response would sort of get them a yes? Keeping in mind that as much as the university appreciates those students that are protesting, they serve a very large population. There are thousands of students on campus. Not every single student agrees with that. So if we are allowing a student organization to protest, let's say on the steps of Wilson Library, and all those students leaving Wilson are now impacted, they have to answer to those students just as much as they have to answer to other students as well. Also keeping in mind university policy that, suggests, the way that the university has to respond to certain things like that. So I guess, and I'm giving a preface, I have to head out to a 6:30 event. So you're going to answer and then I'm going to get up and leave. And that's not because you gave him that answer, but I have to go. But I wanted to add that in. I'm curious to hear your response.
Yeah, I mean, if someone is violating a rule, I think a proportionate response is fine. Like if students are, for example, on the steps of Wilson Library, blocking ingress and egress to the building, people literally can't get in and out. Like, I think it's okay to go and ask those people to move. I would prefer you don't do so with guns, if you can avoid it, right? Like, I mean, I think some proportionality is in order here. But like, I think both things can be true. Like both that civic disobedience of being on the steps of Wilson Library, blocking ingress and egress, is maybe valuable to our society as an act of civic disobedience. I'm not saying that is necessarily true, because frankly, I don't know exactly what situation you're talking about, but that
I just gave a random
right,
scenario.
okay. I wasn't sure like if it was a hypo or real.
Yeah.
Like that can be valuable as a form of civil disobedience, and it can also be disciplined as a form of civil disobedience, or ended as a form of civil disobedience by the university. Like both of those things can coexist simultaneously next to each other, I think. And I think this goes back to like part of why civil disobedience is effective is that it's disobedient, right? It's that belief that this cause is so important that I'm willing to accept potential consequences for breaking the rules. That like that's what makes in some cases like that's what makes the headline, right? Is that you broke the rule, like you believed in this so much that you were willing to get arrested for it. And like that disobedience element is part of what gives power to civil disobedience. That doesn't mean that the university can't clear folks off the steps of the library. Is that?
It does, and I do want to add one extra point, and this is sort of to the law enforcement question, because actually this afternoon, I had a meeting with the chief in a UNC police in a committee setting, and he sort of explained why, as chief, he advocates for so many people to come out, and I'm interested to hear your response. You know, one of the things that he said is that having so many officers come out is sort of a protective net for both the protesters and the officer, because you send one officer out and that officer gets overwhelmed, they're statistically more likely to draw their firearm or draw, pepper spray. And then now we're talking a very dangerous situation. Because when you send more officers, that officer that could be overwhelmed can sort of step back, and there will be other officers that support this sort of response. Out of curiosity, what do you think about that? What do you think about that sort of, I'm trying to send all these officers and it means to protect both the protesters and the officers from this sort of escalation?
I don't think I'm prepared to take a position on police. Like, honestly, like, taking off my fire hat, right? Like, this is just something that I grapple with, like, on a personal level. What level of police involvement in these types of situations is an appropriate level of police involvement? And what is it? Like, that's a hard question. And I don't have any degree in law enforcement. Like, this isn't, I guess I'm giving you, like I said, this is gonna be partially hot takes with Lindsay, and the hot take on this is like, I don't know. And I think it's a very personal, in some ways it's a very personal question that different people are gonna answer in different ways. Like, what I do think is if you have those students on the steps of Wilson Library who are participating in a peaceful act of civil disobedience, and you bring your guns and they're like out of their holsters and you're pointing them at, like, that's definitely crossing the line. Like, I'm comfortable saying that. I don't know in myself where that line is.
Perfect.
Hey, my name is Hannah.
Hi, Hannah.
Nice to meet you.
Hey.
My question regards on like material substantial disruption.
Yeah.
So taking out the vandalism side of this, I know we talk about this a lot, like my media podcast helps prevent talking a lot about that and how it can be very controversial and very subjective.
Yes.
What would you say counts as like a substantial disruption? Taking out the vandalism side of things, like what, like, for example, with the protest that happened with like Palestine and things like that, we talk a lot about, oh, like, does it count as a substantial disruption that maybe a class was disrupted for a compliment? Like, is that a substantial disruption? Like, this is a very subjective statement. So what would you count?
First, I would argue that material and substantial disruption isn't always the correct legal framework when looking at higher education. But if we're going to assume that universities can regulate.
UNC uses it. They just.
Well, just because they use it doesn't mean, I mean, like, I can give you a whole book of policies that universities have that aren't correct, like, aren't legally sound, so that doesn't prove anything. Sorry, not to, that's not meant to dig at you, just like, yeah, okay, they have a policy. But I do think that universities can regulate disruptions. I just don't think under that framework necessarily. And the way that I prefer universities to regulate disruptions is in really objective ways, right? To the extent possible. So for example, if you're regulating protest, can you regulate protest that's over a certain decibel level, in a certain space? Maybe you say, if you're speaking over a conversational volume, I don't know what decibel level that would be because I'm not an expert in such things, inside a campus building during your protest, that's not okay. Or like if you're out on the quad close enough to a building and you give a decibel level, like something very objective, because that limits the university's ability to use subjective reasoning in order to abuse the policy. So that's the type of policy we most like to see on campuses, is really objective policies. To answer the hypothetical you gave, though, we argue all the time that a couple-minute disruption to a class does not constitute a substantial disruption. If it completely derails the class, sure, I think that that is a level of disruption that especially the professor could deal with because that's their classroom, right? But if someone, interrupts once in class, I mean, I'm sure you've all been in classes, right? Where there's someone who doesn't like what the professor just said and busts in the middle of the professor's sentences. Professors in here know what student I'm talking about. Like that's not a reason for punishment. And so why is it a reason for punishment if it's protesters who disrupt your class for the same amount of time that that type of situation would take? Yeah, I don't think a small disruption like that is enough.
So you think that a lot of it is about removing discretion as much as possible?
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
remove discretion as much as possible, absolutely.
Other questions?
Hey, thank you. I guess I'm grappling a lot with just how unprecedented it seems like the pushback on pro-Palestinian protesters has been. And I think one example that is relevant here is, I think it was NYU that changed kind of the definition of Zionism to be equivalent to effectively like, if you're anti-Zionist, you are discriminating against people. When we look historically at what Zionism is, it's a political project, it's a political perspective. It's not the same as anti-Semitism. So I'm wondering if you can maybe put into context some of the contention around words and definitions. This entire past year has been kind of this framing by the media that this is a war against Hamas. Now in Lebanon, right, it's supposed to be a war against Hezbollah. Like these are civilian areas, right? And so we could talk about kind of the contention there, but specifically on American universities, there's this like, you protest and then they redefine what you stand for to the point that it's I don't know of another historical example of that.
I don't know that the redefinition of anti-Semitism is new. In fact, I know that it isn't. Because as long as I've been doing free speech work, we've been arguing over what constitutes anti-Semitism. And what?
Anti-Zionism?
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like that anti-Zionism has been like there has been a population of individuals for at least a decade that have been arguing, probably longer, that have been arguing that anti-Zionism should be included in the definition of anti-Semitism. I mean, going back to like when I was an intern where I work now, like that was already a conversation that was happening. You hear a lot about the IHRE definition of anti-Semitism, which has long included anti-Zionism as part of what it considers anti-Semitism, and policymakers have long been trying to use that definition as a means of creating a legal definition of anti-Semitism. So I don't know that I agree with the basis of the question, which is that like we're in an unprecedented moment with regards to that. Like, I think that's been a push that's been happening for at least a decade, and perhaps it's gathering steam right now because of the particular polarization that's happening currently. Certainly, in New York, but also in Texas, as I talked about earlier, that this is now being like codified into, or I guess not technically codified, but included in executive orders that universities have to follow. But I mean, my organization, our legislative team, has been pushing back against the IHRE definition within legislation for years.
Other questions?
Hello, my name's Anthony. And you mentioned promoting civic discourse in university. My question is, let's say you were in this position of power, being able to do that.
Yeah.
How would you promote civic discourse at a university level? Like, how may a university be able to do that?
That's a really great question. some universities are really thinking about this right now, and I love to see it. University of North Carolina, Asheville has had now a couple of workshops for students on like discourse across differences, like how to engage in civic discourse. And I think that that's a fabulous and very promising type of programming. There's a few institutions that are including that kind of training in their like freshman orientation materials, where from the start, like once you get on campus, we immediately get into this mindset of, okay, we're gonna have conversations with people you don't agree with. And I think that that's fabulous, but I really think it has to start before university. Like it has to start in K-12. And I don't know, like how many of you took a civics class in K-12? Okay, actually more than I would have expected, because sometimes I ask that question. Maybe it's because most of you in school in I don't know if North Carolina has a mandate, probably, yeah. But some states don't. And when I ask that at like national student conventions, there are often about half the room that didn't take a civics course. But it's not even just like civics, right? Learning like how the government works. Like that's a start, but you also need to learn how to have conversations. And so I think civics class needs to not just be taught, like that's a great start, but they need to be taught in a way that is a hands-on civic, right? Like just showing you like, this is how a bill becomes a law. Like who cares how a bill becomes a law? Like that doesn't, it doesn't, I mean, okay, Mary Rose cares. But like that doesn't, I get your point, right? That doesn't affect, like everyday people that much. Like most of us are not gonna be legislators who are like, you know, involved in the process of making a bill into a law, right? Or even lobbyists or in any way like touching on that. But most of us will have a Thanksgiving dinner with family members who we don't agree with and need to be able to have that, you know, dinner in a happy manner, or preferably have that dinner in a happy manner, right? Like that's a skill that all of us could use. So I don't know why it's not being taught.
Any other questions?
I know we're super late, sorry.
Sorry.
Are we running over?
I mean, it's,
This is sort of a quick follow-up, and that is, so, well done. What universities, are there universities, I think there have been universities that have actually handled what's been going on campuses relatively. Yes, there have been a few, I'm just curious, no.
Can you think of one?
Just
And,
one.
you know, this is like really frustrating, because, okay, I'll give you a behind the scenes look at my work.
Right, that's
So-
what I was kind of looking for.
This is what we're here for.
So, okay, the protest started at UNC, the encampment started, and everything was peaceful and everything seemed fine, and there were counter protesters and everything was peaceful and everything seemed fine. And I'm like writing a blog, like, look how cool UNC is for being great and like not sending police out to arrest everyone who's protesting. And then UNC calls the freaking police, and my whole blog has to be scrapped. So for a second there, I thought UNC was gonna be my example, and they're not. I don't know. I don't have, and you know, and I've talked to reporters about this question, and like, I don't know if that's because there's no campuses that are handling it well, or if it's because the campuses that are handling it well aren't just not gonna make the headline.
I think it's the latter, we'll talk over.
Probably. Do you have examples? I would love to hear them.
We'll talk. All right, can we get the last one?
I can talk forever.
All right, you got the last question.
Ooh, last question. So I have this, I want to press your thesis.
Okay.
And I do agree that creating spaces for, you know, nonprofit, non-violent civil disobedience on campus teaches our students how to change the world. Ultimately, that's what protest is about. It's what civil rights story is, change the world. I'm sitting and thinking about my time at the University of Missouri, where this was this perfect storm of protests, where we ultimately got rid of our assistant president and our chancellor because of the student protests. Simultaneous to that, we were having protests in faculty about academic freedom. And then we had protests simultaneous to that for the grad students who were having their benefits cut. And simultaneously, we had protests on campus because of abortion claims. And I'm looking at that, And I'm watching every single act being dismantled. That everything that was done to reshape the way we thought as an institution was upended by the General Assembly. So I'll ask you a question. Are there any examples of contemporary cases on campuses where protests took place that stuck?
Where protests took place and changed policy.
That changed for the better, long term?
So this kind of goes to what Tori was talking about a little bit. There are certain universities where protests to divest were successful in bringing a divestment vote or getting the university to at least examine divestment in a way that we don't know what the ultimate outcome of those would be looking at encampments, but there is at least an argument that those protests achieved their initial goal of forcing the university to examine their investments in Israel, right? So I think that's a potential example of
That's a good example.
of protests working.
You know, and I think part of the difficulty of answering this question is that, like, hindsight is 20/20. So we don't have that hindsight in this moment yet. I mean, you know, within my lifetime, the South Africa divestment protest, like those were, I mean, I'm not that old, right? And those were successful in many campuses.
I did. Okay.
Right. So, I mean, I feel like that's a recent-ish example, right? That's not that long ago. But it's really hard, I think, to look at a current moment and say, oh, well, this protest has led to this. I mean, you know, pro-Palestine protest, I think you could argue, has led to policy changes in places like New York and Texas. Whether you agree with those policy changes or not depends on who you are. And so it's hard, I think, in our moment right here, you know, I think we all have, including me, our own perspective on the current situation in the Middle East. And, you know, some people would think that the fact that the governor of Texas has said, you know, anti-Zionism is included in anti-Semitism, some people would think that's great and that is a success of their free speech. So I don't know. Ask me in 20 years how this.
You'll be our keynote in 20 years.
Something kind of.
We've signed you up.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay, for.
Thank you.
Matter, if there's any food, take it with you on the way out. If you have roommates, if you have friends, if you know anyone, take the food. Thank you so much for joining us for our hangover fun day.
I have got pearls.
That was,
I think I remember seeing your picture post and all.
I would-
That's too right.
So